Ansible diagrams.
Geopolítica política, portanto, não é? Já é um bocadinho.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is a pleasure to be able to present again and to have again with us Professor Oliver Richmond from the University of Manchester. He has been in Coimbra for a couple of times, few times, yes. He's a fan of ours, and we actually enjoy that a lot. He's always welcome, very welcome. I will make a very brief introduction, presentation of Professor Oliver Richmond. And of course, because the important thing here is to listen to what he has to say. Professor Oliver Richmond, as I mentioned, is now based at the University of Manchester. He has been previously also at the University of St. Andrews. He is also, I don't know if I actually can say this, Kyung-hee University in South Korea. He's a professor, international professor in South Korea. He is also editor and co-editor of various publications, namely Peace Building, which he is co-editing with Professor Roger McGinty, but also the popular book series Rethinking Peace in Conflict Studies. Oliver Richmond's primary area of expertise is peace and security, peace and conflict theory, and particularly the interlinkages with international relations theory. His topic for today is fragile state building and peace formation, a topic that he's been working on in the past years, also relating with his previous work and research on peace building, on critical peace building, critics to liberal peace, and of course it is very important to have the opportunity to discuss these issues with someone that has been so actively involved in this research area. So very welcome to Coimbra, Oliver, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, thanks for a very kind introduction, and I'm pleased to see that there are some people in the room. I heard that there was a big festival going on, and that I would expect to be talking only to a camera, just in case some of you may want to watch it in future, having not been able to make it. So I'm gratified that there are some people here, that you're suffering with your hangovers and so forth. I hope I don't make it worse. I probably will. But anyway, my talk is called Failed State Building versus Peace Formation, and this is something I've been working on for a while now. I hope it's inching its way not to a conclusion or to a resolution, but to perhaps a new set of questions, at which point I will call it quits and retire from this project and hopefully move on, because it's been bugging me for a long time. I think it's a project which was perhaps a little bit too ambitious, and I'll try and explain why, but also has, I think, thrown up some interesting and very disturbing, for me at least, questions. Disturbing as a peace researcher and as an IR theorist. So perhaps I'll start off with some controversial assertions. IR theory is dead. It's finished. It has no purchase in the contemporary world environment, as we know it, at least. Peace studies is in a very difficult ethical dilemma situation. And the state and the international, two sites around which power, organisation and hopes for peace have gathered over the last 100 years or so, are also very troubled. And all of this means what's left. It raises the question of, well, what is left if one is to have a site of emancipation, a site of progressive thinking, a site of agency, a site of politics, a site in which institutions for peace and order may be built. This is why my talk is called Failed State Building versus Peace Formation. I try to put together these conceptual frameworks which have been used to order the world in the last 10 or 15 years, failed states and state building, into one catchy slogan, fail state building, which I think is what's been going on, versus peace formation, which for me is a conceptual attempt to underline the ways in which political agency of the subject of state building, i.e. of us, of the citizen, has been removed. And I try to do this by tracing 3, perhaps 4 separate literatures through IR theory and peace and conflict studies and conceptual frameworks in the policy world too. I should note that it's very peculiar. One of the things that has become very obvious is that all of these conceptual frameworks, which we see developing in peace and conflict studies and being widely adopted in the policy world and in international relations theory, all came more or less from the policy setting in the first place, which sort of raises a question about the purchase and utility of IR theory. Are we merely problem solvers for policymakers and elites who want to further emancipatory practice or want to disguise their curtailment of emancipatory practice? As researchers working in peace and conflict and IR theory, is our project one of emancipation or one of implementation? And it seems to me that when we look at concepts like state building and its earlier brother, state formation, or peace building, conflict resolution, conflict transformation, and so on, much of this thinking was pushed through the policy world, either through academics who had revolving door relationships in the policy sectors, in the institutions or dominant states or donors, or directly from international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which I think is something which we never or rarely stop to consider. Why are we using the language of, I don't mean to say the enemy, but I will anyway, the enemy, as it were, who seem to be not ambitious enough, not radical enough, not progressive enough, not willing to share enough, not willing to lead enough, not enlightened enough? Why do we as scholars use this language? It's one of these open-ended questions which has come up. But I think this problem is riven through the work that we do, the way we methodologically frame our studies in international relations and in peace and conflict studies. For example, I'm very concerned about the way in which we use the term the field. This is one of the things that comes up from the juxtaposition that I will make in my paper between state formation, state building, peace building, and the missing other, the subject, the citizen, those who exercise political agency in a supposedly democratizing world. Now, why do we call the putative democratic citizen space out there the field? I think it's a pretty important question, one that's never been asked already. Has it been asked? Or it's been asked in other disciplines, and not in IR. When you go to other disciplines and you look at this question, you see statements like research for the ethnographic subject or the indigenous subject is regarded as genocide. In other words, that the language that we use is the language of power, and it expunges the subject. It removes agency from the very practices, the very thinking, the very normative frameworks that we claim as scholars, as peace and conflict theorists, and practitioners we wish to establish. So the field, as an example, is redolent of early British colonial anthropology. Its objective was to establish an immediate racial hierarchy between the researcher and the subject, one in which the researcher was attached to government and therefore power, the British colonial engine, particularly in India and sub-Saharan Africa. And the establishment of a racial hierarchy meant an intellectual hierarchy, it meant a cultural hierarchy, it meant the establishment of a natural order in which the British paternalistic institutional framework, which was to be one of civilizing the native, one of bringing enlightenment, the benefits of Western progressive thinking circa 1880, 1890, to its very subjects through disciplinary engagement, not through love, but through tough love, is a language framework which is carried all the way through modern research until today. So practitioners in New York call Geneva the field. practitioners in all the main donor countries will look at Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so forth, the Pacific Islands, and wherever it is that they're engaged, and they will call it, without any embarrassment, the field, immediately invoking a whole set of epistemic power relations. That's just one small example to start things off, but much of the language which we still use when we talk about emancipatory and progressive thinking in peace and conflict studies, when we talk about the state as a site of organisation, when we talk about the international as a site of peace and order, replicates this type of pattern, I think. So what I do in this paper, in order to try and get from kind of this rather less than mainstream position into something meaningful, is compare the way in which modern state building thinking has drawn upon fairly recent modernization theory, particularly to do with state formation and arguments about state formation, Tilly and Scott Bowen and many others. And I also compare that with the liberal peace building or the peace building literature and how all of this then is translated into a set of policy and practitioner frameworks. And to cut a very long story short, I make the obvious argument that where we have a focus on the state, which is state building, state formation, and the contesting of the state formation talks about how the state is built through opposing forces within. So the state is an internal contestation, and the institutions and frameworks that come out of this are a product of a domestic contest, often having regional impacts. But it's very much an idea that there are indigenous forces which build the state. Whereas state building is the reverse. It very much presents the argument that the indigenous forces, the local actors, cannot be trusted to build a state. They are far too corrupt, far too dangerous, far too prone to using the means of violence and war, and therefore this has to be curtailed, and the state has to be built according to a pro forma blueprint from the outside. This is the sort of language that you see in IMF documentation from the early 1990s onwards, pretty soon picked up by the World Bank, resisted by the UN, but still creeping into even UNDP documentation today. Peace building, as a kind of alternative, is a little bit different, but nonetheless still quite troubling. From its early genesis in academic literature, as a grassroots, bottom-up type practice or process, in which individuals and communities would come together to resist the forces, the ideological forces to which they were subject to, the injustices to which they were subject to, the dispossession and so forth. It was very rapidly translated into a top-down externalized project which would be run by the UN in a normative framework. So whereas state formation focuses on the use of violence, state building focuses much more on the provision of security in a marketized setting. Peace building focuses on a global order underpinned by a liberal normative framework of rights, democracy, representation, and human rights. Human rights determined by abstract notions of the self, not by material notions of needs. One of the products of the end of the Cold War was that the needs arguments were, if you like, eviscerated from any discussion of peace and order at the international level. Liberal peace building is very much focused on this normative international order, some sense of renewed cosmopolitan space which could be projected down onto the willing supplicants, the subjects within the post-conflict and developmental settings of the world. So whereas peace building is something which projects a normative order, it's an extension of the liberal internationalist dream of the late 19th century and the early to mid-20th century. State building projects a much more reductive order in which the firm security and marketized institutions of state are all that's required. The norms are jettisoned, effectively. So the order that's built is one which is very much based on a state jigsaw, kind of a light Westphalia, if you like. Now, if we start looking at this literature in a little bit more detail, which we can do, a few notes here. State formation, state building, peace building, etc. Let's go back to state formation. State formation is a very important literature in this development. I think we're now in a position in peace and conflict theory, but also in international relations theory, to see very much how dominant, reductive, and not particularly progressive understandings of contemporary and European history drove the production of theory and practice. And state formation was one of these types of theoretical frameworks. It's very much on the realist side of the IR theory agenda. It sees the state as a kind of institutional, criminal, elite or feudal racket, all of which moderate each other, in which there eventually emerges some kind of balance of fear, balance of terror, which is consolidated in an institutional setting, which maintains some semblance of order, but a very negative piece at best. So the state itself, in state formation literature, I mean, and here we're talking about European or Western states, not just about the soon-to-be post-colonial states of the 1950s and 1960s, but also the historic formulation of the state in the West was always seen to be a predatory, criminal racket in which a kind of local balance of power played out until all of the elites got their way and produced a set of institutions which imposed an order on their subjects. Their subjects were seen mainly as individuals providing the means for the state formation process to come into being, so taxation, resources, manpower for warfare, and so forth. And from that kind of framework, we eventually emerged this notion of the struggles which led to the Westphalian state, the territorialized state with a fixed population, a fixed hierarchy in which the state itself magnified agency. And this is the important thing about the state formation process. What is the point of forming a state? Something which is not discussed in this literature, but this literature is embedded in a modernization framework. So of course the point of building any state is to magnify to an industrial scale the agency, the sum of the parts being greater than the parts themselves, which means in terms of warfare, in terms of making money, in terms of developing an economy, in terms of international status, you have a viable actor on the international scene. So the underlying assumption is without the state, forget how the state is formed and all the violence of state formation, without the state there is no viable actor on the international stage, both in economic, military or political terms. This is absolutely crucial because this, I think, underpins both peace building and state building practice much later. It presents a very negative view of agency. Subjects fight, they are corrupt, they are predatory, or they are passive and herded around in various directions by their elites. Everyone's subject to a hierarchy. And the state itself is at best a dystopia. So no socialist utopias, no democratic utopias, and so on. Now, I think this is really important because this underpins state building logic. So here I'm jumping the liberal peace building framework for a little while because the peace building was kind of an interim debate. When state building came back big time, it was in the 2000s with Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. And state building rests on this same argument with one significant difference. The responsibility for building the state now goes to the international. So the state is no longer something which is a product of local forces. Local forces must be tamed, local agency must be tamed, and the international actors, whether in a military perspective or within some kind of international financial institution structural adjustment framework, would take responsibility for building the state. So the state that emerges from state building still rests on this idea of negative local agency, the fact that actors on the ground cannot be trusted to produce anything other than a predatory, hierarchical set of institutions through the contestation of local power. So what you do is you nullify their agency. You take away the agency, and you script, you establish, you create a whole range of discursive practices, policy agendas and instruments which determine the political character of the state to be built. Now, the state that emerges from the state building framework is a neoliberal state. It's one which has high security capacity, low participatory capacity, and its economic capacity depends on its position in the international markets. So this is a state which is not capable of making a positive peace, from my perspective. The point of this state is it is minimalist. It only provides security. It doesn't provide for what we would call social justice, emancipatory, progressive notions of thinking about peace, and so forth. And this is a purposeful agenda. It's established for a number of different reasons. One is the internationals are afraid of extending their intervention from the military into the political and social, having learned the lessons of the 1990s. So they're saying, well, we'll build neoliberal states because it means we don't have to get involved in the kind of governmental practices that we were involved in the 1990s, in the liberal peace-building framework, which I'll come to in a sec. The other, of course, is it suits ideologically the range of international institutions, with the exception of the UN, directly at least, and what they do with their money in development and state building and intervention practices. In other words, you create self-sufficient, resilient actors, and you do that through tough love. You don't give them anything for free. Otherwise, you create dependencies and so forth. This is an old, tedious story which we hear repeated over and over again, and as I mentioned, it misses a number of important scientific facts. So the state itself is small, and it is unable to intervene in society. It is unable to equalise, to balance. In other words, it's unable to do all the basic things that one would need to do in a conflict environment. This is why I call it failed state building, because drawing on the state formation literature, modernisation theory, which is embedded in these hierarchical historical attitudes which have been fed through international relations as a policy-driven discipline, we come to a logic where state building builds states which are probably the worst suited to the political environments in which they are dropped. And having said all of that, I talked about politics, I've talked about economics, I haven't really talked about politics. There are still big question marks over the way in which the formal technical democratization process, which are also used, operate in these post-conflict sites, whether they actually produce more tension than they mitigate, at least in the short term, and so on. But the biggest question for me still rests on the culture and identity side of things, too. Surely if we are to be building democratic states, then everything in that state has to be determined by its subjects. In other words, everybody in the state is a subject, whether a leader or a citizen. And that's simply not the case. So in other words, the state-building project is actually rather anti-democratic, and it's certainly anti-social justice. So the inability to express one's political ideology or one's historic identity in the context, the broader context of the international community and international norms and pluralism and so forth, means that this is a project which really resonates with the liberal imperialism of the 1890s. And that, of course, is a fact which has not gone unnoticed amongst the several hundred million subjects of state building around the world. As we've seen, there's been an awful lot of resistance. If I could just step back a second to peace building. Peace building, I think, is a little bit more complicated than state building. In the sense that peace building is a normative agenda, effectively. Peace building was a framework in which one began to talk about democratization in value terms. One began to talk about human rights in contexts which were perhaps alien to the rationalistic, individualistic settings which many of the initially Western policymakers who put together these initial peace-building frameworks in the 1990s imagined. And very soon it began to be caught up in a discussion of, well, how is human rights thought of in non-Western contexts, or in non-liberal contexts? How would human rights become more participatory and less technocratic? How would democracy follow in the same vein? In a way, peace-building was a victim of its own success, because it established a position where it said, well, we realise that there's been historic injustice. We realise that the current state system itself is a product of long-term historic injustice. But what we're going to do is we're going to pluralise it and work backwards. We're going to say, this isn't year zero, but we're going to slowly start addressing those various inequalities and injustices that we see around the world. And we're going to do that by establishing local and global democracy, and by engaging with human rights frameworks which extend developmentally, eventually, into global transfers. In other words, issues of global inequality. Now that was the far, far, far long-term projected view of peace building as it was imagined by the liberal policymakers of the early 1990s, and of course they never got anywhere near there, because very soon a whole cohort of policymakers and scholars interjected themselves into this peace building agenda and began to, in a very conservative way, liberalise it. In other words, began to capture it within the North American or Anglo-Saxon imaginary of what liberalism itself means and offers, extending slowly into the terrain of neoliberalism as liberalism itself began to mutate in policy instruments under great pressure from the IFIs, of course. So what peace building gives us is an extension of the liberal internationalist dream that one could construct an international system which would be, on the one hand, free-floating. The international system would not depend on its domestic constituent parts. It didn't matter what the states did, as long as the international system itself did. International law, the institutions, and so on. All of these would, in various ways, engage with transforming the state and domestic landscape around the world, regardless of what the state and the domestic landscape itself was. Establishing a normative argument for this, a universal or cosmopolitan normative argument for this, let's say a thin cosmopolitan universal argument for it. And then looking back through history and saying, well, there are grounds for universalising human rights and universalising democracy. You know, these awful things that we did in the past, colonialism, slavery, all the rest of it, these wouldn't have happened if there had been democracy and human rights and so forth. So these are strong grounds for making this first step the basis of any state in which we intervene. So this is kind of soft conditionality or normative conditionality, which begins to shift this whole notion of peace building, which started with the grassroots, ended up at the international, and then was fed back into the notion of the liberal demos, the constituent part of the cosmopolitan order. But losing, along the way, this notion of what it meant to be part of an emancipatory project, to be part of what a discussion, an ongoing discussion would look like about the new conditions for social, political, economic emancipation in the changing world order. Now, surprisingly, given that I edit a journal called Peace Building, I think peace building is dead. I think state building is also in big trouble because, conceptually speaking, they do not speak to their subjects. And for as long as there is this enormous gap, peace building projects a normative framework which it cannot live up to, and which is not that inclusive of many of its subjects in different locations around the world. State building creates a state framework which does not benefit its subjects, for the most part, in post-conflict or developmental settings. So why would any democratic system be part? Why would any citizen in a democratic system be part of that? And as we see, I think in practice, there's an awful lot of opt-outs going. Okay, if I take a step back for a second, peace building, state formation. We have something missing. I'll show you this little diagram to illustrate this. In the kind of historic understanding of the projection of order, the development of order in its social, political, economic frames, we have liberal peace building and state building here, standing at the top. They are kind of two attempts by dominant players. We call them donors now, but it's mainly a handful of donors at certain points in the last 20 years to shape the post-colonial or what they call underdeveloped world in ways in which they can enter markets and eventually, if you like, be part of this world order they imagine. Now, the thing is that what's actually happening here is not an equalisation of subjects, it's a maintenance of the existing hierarchy. So if you look back through history, again, you see this formation of a hierarchy of states, which we all know, we all live as part of it, and we don't see much attempt to do anything about it. So the framework that emerges from peace building and state building is a lift all boats framework. It's not an equalise. It's not deal with international inequality. It's not a distribution framework or a redistribution, distributive justice and so on. So state building, very keen on building the firm security framework for a state system, regional and domestic stability is the focus, etc., etc. Peace building, very interested on normative aspects, but mainly at the international level, the international architecture of peace building. State formation underpins all of this. It provides the, if you like, the constraints about the normative frameworks, about the security frameworks, and about the capacity to deal with justice. In other words, to go into a kind of redistributive framework, because it echoes forever the warning. The state system was built by the West for the West to maintain a particular hierarchy, and it was a contestation of power within the West. We struggled, we fought for our states, and therefore we can't really give up what we have and where we are. And you can see this figure then when it comes to looking numerically. Arms budgets versus aid budgets and so forth is the big giveaway. So what we have here is power acting through state building and peace building on those bits of the world which are still fragmented, which are still not part of the accepted form in political, economic and security terms. So the best that we can get from this is a kind of negative understanding of order. A negative piece is very conservative. It's probably a victor's piece still, but it's dressed up. But I would say it's mutton dressed up as lamb. So what's missing? Let me just go back up. Well, if we have this idea of state formation, what's absolutely essential about state formation is it's the only one of these three theoretical debates, state formation, state building, and peace building, which is internal, in which agency is exercised internally. So in other words, all agency that's exercised internally, if we want to use this simplistically, is negative, violent, criminal, and predatory. And that's why state formation stands out, because this is the basis through which state building and peace building develop their automatic and ambivalent rights to intervene in the various social, political, and security terrains that they do. So it's a simple premise. State formation is the only theory we have in international relations which suggests that local agency, the agency of subjects, is active in building states. And look what type of states it builds. Those people can't be trusted, is what it says. So peace building and state building reverse this. Look, these people would build these awful states. Look what they did in the past. And in fact, look what we did in the past in Europe. We can't allow that to happen again. Therefore, what we need is to reverse the agency framework. We need to reverse the structures through which power operates. So state building and peace building do that. And what's missing, of course, from this is blatantly obvious. It's the idea that politics, agency, is exercised in any democratic context in which human rights is more than rhetoric by subjects. Subjects, we're all citizens. In other words, what happens when there are significant groups or insignificant groups in any society, in any polity, in any state or international structure who exercise agency? And why are they absent? That's why I mentioned at the beginning of my talk Linda Smith's famous statement, research is genocide. What she meant was Western methodology behaves genocidally to the ethnographic subject, whether they are indigenous people or even increasingly Western subjects. So what's missing, and here I've coined a new term, feel free to ignore it, called peace formation. So in other words, we act, there are those of us who are interested in peace, order, stability, progressivism, emancipation, and so forth. Perhaps there are a few of us in this room, I don't know, maybe it's unlikely. But the point is that there are, in any space and across literature, documented throughout history and in contemporary times, a whole range of actors who contest peace building, state building, and contest the underlying argument that local agency is incapable, should be subject to good governance, needs to have its capacity built, is corrupt, is inherently violent. And this contestation is ongoing. Sometimes it's organised in formal public spaces, in civil society, through state institutions even. Sometimes it's hidden away. Sometimes it's resistant. Often it's insurgent. And there's no surprise that recently there's been a move in both policy settings and in some critical IR and peace and conflict settings to start to equate insurgency with peace building. Some critical scholars think that's a good thing. Many policymakers use it as a way of putting the local agent very close to the terrorist. In other words, again, discrediting the agency of local actors, organisations, institutions, networks, as well as states' frameworks, to act for peace, to think about emancipation, to challenge the dominant blueprints through which hegemony is expressed, and so forth. So it's a bit of a surprise that we don't have any conceptual language in international relations for understanding how subjects act, and why they act, and what they do. One important caveat here should be that even going back to Gramsci, there was a realisation that understanding how subjects act is actually quite a dangerous thing. One does not want to expose the agency of the fragile subject. Notice I'm not talking about the fragile state. One does not want to expose that agency to the all-reaching, all-seeking power, the structural or governmental power of the state, or of a range of international organisations and institutions. So this is a difficult problem. So here we are in 2013, sitting in a room full of international relations scholars, peace and conflict scholars, and perhaps others. And international relations appears to have arrived at a point at which other social science disciplines in the West were decades ago, starting to recognise its subjectivity, starting to recognise the workings of power and the dangers of complicity and the ways in which the subject is objectified, conditioned, and its politics are removed. Seems a bit late. Anyway, the point of peace formation, as far as I can see, is to try and push out some space and to say, yes, state formation happens, but so does peace formation. They happen in a range of different spaces, local, network, transversal, and transnational spaces. It's often been described using the baggage of Western anthropology and ethnography as primitive or backward, or using the baggage of Western ideological contests as ideologically defunct, using a whole range of different baggages from Western epistemic frameworks. The constant theme is the denigration of local agency. It's just either not there, or it's not competent, or it's not capable. Now, if we are, as peace and conflict scholars, to take local agency seriously, to take peace seriously, we have to move into terrains that don't just include the international, the liberal internationalist stream, whether it comes from the left or the right. Not just the neoliberal or social welfare stream of the state, but we also have to engage with what happens in community. So this peace formation framework, which I'm trying to develop, and really it's just at the moment a whole range of an exercise in cataloguing, a whole range of different exercises of agency in the face of overwhelming governmental or structural power around the world in sites of great fragility. And the more I look at literature, the more and more I see hidden away. And here it is, epistemic ordering in almost every article you read. So, here we go, abstract. The International tried this and it failed. There was a war between two states, it led to this problem. Had some effect on the local people. Poor them. So in came the Internationals. They tried this, they tried structural adjustment, they tried some development, etc., etc. It worked, it didn't work, it worked, it didn't work, and never any mention of them again in the paper. There's a kind of ordering, a hierarchy, a repetition of this epistemic genocide, which we often unthinkingly repeat in our work, through focusing on putting the state back together, and through focusing on the importation of liberal international, liberal peace norms and frameworks. Well, if the world was that simple, maybe that would be okay, I don't know. But it isn't. And as we go through this literature, we start to see that there are so many examples, very hard to capture. There are many epistemic barriers and methodological barriers that we have, because we are the children of genocidal epistemology in our research and in our policy, which prevents us from engaging with it, which, even if we then are forced to engage with it, immediately say this is backward, this raises all kinds of normative problems or gender issues, and so forth. But increasingly we start to see also some, let's say, leverage around these sorts of critiques which remove local agency. We start to see arguments, for example, Ken Menkhouse's work in Somalia and Somaliland, which shows that the whole Kaplan-esque language of the failed and collapsed state in Somalia post-94 has hidden away the fact that many Somaliland people have organised institutions, maintained security, done policing, distributed resources, mitigated inequality, and done all the things that the state would do, provide healthcare and so forth. It's uneven and it's difficult because in these modern times, the scale of population, the scale of needs, the scale of requirements is far greater than communal social systems can ever provide. But people still try. In other words, people are exercising their agency. They're thinking in progressive terms about how one may construct a peaceful order in their immediate context, given the structural problems they may face and the needs that their communities may have. Of course, there are many of them who may be involved and implicated in conflict or corruption. But again, these things are double-edged concepts, because there are also political reasons for why conflict, corruption, and so forth occur. And sometimes these can be turned around, as Menkhouse's work shows, to show that behind it is an underlying search for order, peace, justice, space, land, and so forth, which are other sides of the same coin, peace and conflict. That's just one example. I mean, in my own work, I've looked at how the state of East Timor has been indigenized, hybridized, it's combined modern institutions, modern expectations, it's extended the democratic ethos far beyond that which the internationals would like. At the same time, it has imported imagined, historic, spiritual frameworks to produce social order as well as political and economic institutions. We see the same pattern emerging across a lot of the South Pacific states, by the way, as well as in many of the sub-Saharan African states, where custom meets modernity. And it's forced a rethinking of custom in international relations. Well, no, let's rephrase that. It's forced a rethinking of custom, but not by many international relations scholars. In other words, we have to start to see, if we do believe in rights and democracy, where these things are also present in custom, to a degree. We also have to see, as people like Volker Berger have argued, that any local social pre-conflict system has always evolved side by side with conflict institutions for order and peace. And that these themselves, this is peace formation, these themselves provide indicators through which one might build a stable and legitimate order and authority. Okay, I'm sure we're running out of time, so I will perhaps...
Yes, still have 4 more minutes.
4 minutes?
A couple
Okay.
more minutes.
A couple of minutes.
I would say
Okay.
10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, oh, that's good. In that case, I can go on. So this means then a number of issues, conceptual frameworks, and the realities of politics on the ground are inserting themselves into peace building and state building. Perhaps it explains why the states that have emerged from state building tend to be rather authoritarian, rather localized, or customized, as some people like to say, and why the peace is often inexplicably stable or unstable, depending on where you are. You know, why is Somaliland so stable? Why is Timor stable at certain points and not others? Why hasn't Bosnia gone back to war? These are questions which nobody's really asking. And underlying, I think, all of this are a whole range of social practices that come from the people who are living with those circumstances, living with structural adjustment style peace building and state building, but also living with the legacy of their own conflict, the breakdown of their own pre-conflict institutions, reviving the things they felt were used in the past to moderate, mitigate tensions, providing politics, and so forth. They're working it out for themselves, they're acting. And they're thinking about the new conditions of formation, peace formation, emancipation, progressive politics, and so forth. So this raises this question of, well, what does it mean about power and authority and legitimacy in a post-conflict peace-building site? And this is where I want to end, really, because these are the new sets of questions that arise. I can leave you with this little diagram which you should be looking at while I finish things off. You can see here, this is a diagram which kind of defines this whole state building, state formation, peace building, and peace formation relationship. I'm going to make it tiny small so it's all there. Yeah, okay, well, anyway. So you can see state formation, state building, peace formation, or peace building. They're any kind of circular relationship. My point there is that power, agency, is circulating. And as power and agency circulates through a whole range of oppositions, which we call politics normally, there is a contest over what the state should look like, what the state should do in a post-conflict environment, how it should contribute to peace, what that form of peace would look like, what agency would do from a variety of different perspectives, international, IFI, UN, INGO, versus local civil society, versus customary or the local, versus a whole range of agencies which we don't get to see at all. One thing that I think we have to remember about peace formation is that there's a range of different expressions of it. It can happen in a hidden way. In other words, as a subject in a conflict situation, involved in a situation with which you have, let's say, some politics going on, whether it's a stance of the internationals or, let's say, some kind of local warlord, where you're thinking, how can we deal with this? How can we produce some better system? How can I perhaps make things better for my family? How can I perhaps make things better for the village? And so on. You are acting. Now, you might be acting in a hidden way, because of course you don't get killed, but you're still acting. In other words, you develop very sophisticated modes of what Roger McGinty's calling everyday diplomacy. I have a slight problem with the term, but anyway, I think it kind of works. The idea that you develop ways in which you don't expose yourself, but you also act out your politics. You might be more public, you might operate in the formal civil society, which some donors these days pretend they're funding. You might form your own, well, I've been calling it kind of subsistence civil society, where you moonlight, you produce organisations and agencies that do various things in conflict resolution and transformation after work, or in between farming, or just in the village community. Maybe you're involved in converting custom at the village level, in seeing how custom meets modernity, producing new forms of custom. Custom has always been something which has been prone to modernisation itself. Anyway, maybe you are involved in local peace committees. Maybe you see these peace committees being brought into the state. Maybe you end up being the Minister of Peace in a formal state institution. In other words, this peace formation thing operates as a form of agency from the hidden to escape sanction, to escape danger, to the public. From the family, the private, to the public space. From the marketplace, the village, to the region, to the state. And these are the groups, and maybe they're small, but these are the groups of people who organise or act in various ways, because somewhere in the back of their mind, in the network they have, this transversal, transnational, transscalar network, in which there really isn't much local anymore, or much international. They're both figments of the Western imagination, effectively. You are acting for peace. You are acting because you want to see conditions improve, you want to have a more stable and balanced order, and you want to have a fairer share or distribution of the various material or social, political resources, the resources that go with citizenship in the modern state. So there is some kind of hope here for the state-building fraternity. Much of the focus of this type of action does ultimately trickle up to a state institution, and it does operate with some understanding of the international and its liberal norms in mind. But also there's some tension over these things. There's a tension over what the state does, its different ideological framings. And there's also a tension over the international and how far it goes, what it can do, and so forth. This is a contestation of authority, ultimately. How does one, therefore, rebuild legitimate authority in a post-conflict site where indigenous modes of transformation, resolution, or peace have collapsed, while still remaining connected to them, in other words, while maintaining legitimacy? Well, I would suggest, as with my earlier critique of the word field in methodology, that the word intervention is a problem. It gives us, in the IR and peace and conflict community, the comforting sensibility that we can actually do something, exerting our power legitimately. In other words, we harness our resources according to liberal norms, and we intervene, and out of that intervention comes the results that we expect. There are no peace-building or state-building examples that confirm that in the last 20 years. Everything that's arisen has been unexpected. And in fact, what we've seen, as David Chandler often says, are the limits of the power of the internationals through this process. They have denuded themselves and proved that the emperor wears no clothes. So what we see happening here in this kind of circular framework between peace formation, this local agency, often very small, without the kind of capacities of industrialised modernity, the liberal peace-building normative, state-building, much more focused on the kind of security, marketized frameworks, and state formation, which is this kind of mythical barbarian out there, which we must avoid. In the circulation of power between these, I think we can see three types of let's say three types of power, which are crucial for thinking about peace building. The first is structural power. Structural power is the exercise of military or economic or political force in ways in which the subject has no choice. I'm drawing on the work here of Susan Strange and others. Now, we don't really see structural power being exercised in the name of peace very often. Well, it notably happened, let's say 1945, and very occasionally, you might say, Iraq and Afghanistan, to some degree, you saw the exercise of structural power. There was no sense that there should be a consensual engagement at all. Structural power clearly produces a victor's peace. It won't have consent, it'll have little support at the social level. It will probably be an excuse, or it would probably be a reason for the implementation of a purely externalized settlement and set of institutions, and so forth. So peace formation would have no space in this. But remember, the argument I've made about peace formation is it doesn't need space. It makes its own. However small, it's an annoying pinprick, sometimes more. The second type of power, which I think is significant and expressed in the context of peace, is governmental power, Foucault's governmentality. And this is much more about the liberal peace building and the state building nexus. So power here is expressed in a way. Remember, Foucault says that governmentality always requires consent. We are willing victims in this framework, in this exercise of power. As our nature and biology, as well as our social, political, and economic context is transformed, we go along with it because we see no choice, or we agree. And I think that's pretty much how we've seen the peace-building framework exercising its authority. But of course, in the new modernity, where Western capitalism is in crisis, and where democracy itself seems also to be ineffective and to be often circumvented by the very leaders who we thought should be protecting it, there's something of a crisis of this exercise of governmentality from the perspective of the subjects around the world. That's not to say that they don't aspire to democracy, they don't aspire to modern capitalism and so forth, but it's starting to be even more unsettled in that imaginary, in the subject's imaginary, than it was when it seemed to be working very well during the 1990s and so on. So this is governmental power. And I think the governmentality, the power that's being exercised at this point, has reached its limits, just as we saw the structural power very rapidly reaching its limits. I mean, what's happening now in Syria is an example of the limits of both, I would say. So what's left? Structural power rests on legitimacy of force. Governmental power rests on the legitimacy of an externalized model in a hierarchy. It needs a historic hierarchy, which has led to a certain process, a progressive moment where you can say, this is the shining city on the hill, the cosmopolitan armour which you need to don. What's left is subaltern agency, and that's my peace formation. And this is the thing that we really don't understand, and yet, even in international relations, and certainly in peace and conflict studies, it should come first. In other words, the epistemic reading, which I gave you, which was a kind of cliche, but where the article starts with the international state and mentions the subjects briefly, and then forgets about them for the rest of the 8,000 words of the article, needs to be reversed. It needs to start with the subjects. It needs to start with rights. It needs to start with how they perceive order, the state, and the international. When one starts to adopt this peace formation process, when one starts to place it in this context of the circulation of power between these different sites of power in modernity, the state and the international, when one puts it in there, it unsettles, but it also, I think, produces some interesting possibilities for rethinking the new conditions of social emancipation, emancipatory peace, the framework of the state, and the sorts of reforms that the international itself may require, if there is to be a more viable peace and order framework developing in future. And many of those terms and conditions are not unexpected. I mean, if I am to be forced to make any kind of predictions, which I hate doing, but I would say social welfare and social democracy are probably good conflict management systems in a state. The market isn't, unfortunately. Maybe in the long term, but certainly not in the short term. That's the lesson that we see repeated time and time again throughout the post-conflict sites in the last 200 years since the American Civil War. Democracy. Democracy has contradictory effects, but people aspire to have rights and representation. Along with democracy goes rights. It's contradictory, of course, because many societies are commonly organised or have expectations of social property. And these are very disruptive reforms to introduce, democratic reforms to introduce. There are many unintended consequences when you provide people with individualistic understandings of rights, even if they are then able to represent themselves. I don't think we've really worked through that, but I don't think it will lead to the end of democracy to work through that. I just think we need to be a bit more nuanced about democracy. It's quite interesting when you go to villages in Timor and they talk about their democracy, but it's a communal democracy. Anyway, there are many different examples that we could be thinking about. It doesn't have to be just one type, one procedural framework, and so on. In other words, there are conditions in which we can start to see what resembles the current international architecture for peace building, but it's far more nuanced, it's far more inclusive, it's more pluralist, it's been extended. This doesn't mean the end of the UN, it doesn't mean the end of the international financial institutions. Maybe it means they do what they were originally intended to do under the old Bretton Woods system. Maybe it means that we actually start to look at the data more carefully and realise that under the Bretton Woods system, growth was higher than it has been under the modern neoliberal capitalist system. Maybe it means that we might recognise that inequality is a scientifically proven and confirmed time and time again throughout modern scientific history factor which underlies all conflicts, political, social and economic inequality, and not just local and global. In other words, once you bring in peace formation, you start to see some pretty big issues, and unfortunately, our heads have been in the sand in international relations. We've been ostrich-like, burying our heads and saying, these things will go away. This is the product of history. We just need to work around the margins to refine things. I think we have to be much more radical than that. And peace formation, I think, at least in peace and conflict studies, is a little start. It's a little beginning for that project.
Thank you. Now to debates. I'm sure there are a lot of comments and questions and questionings that we want to do, so please feel free. Raise your hands.
Well, thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for coming back to Coimbra. My question goes to the very beginning of your presentation when you asked why do we use the language of the enemy? And I believe this is the very core of the role of the critiques, because I see that the very language framework that is advanced in this kind of post-conflict scenario is one of the main barriers that we have to face in order to overcome and have a more participatory kind of peace. So my question to you is, after all this field work or the research that you did, it still makes sense to call the relationships that we see happening on the ground as peace? Because what I see is that we usually challenge the adjective, like liberal. This is a liberal peace and should not be liberal, or is too liberal or not liberal enough, and so on and so on. But the kind of relationship that we see is a very entrenched in a very deep power relation, and you also mentioned that resembles the liberal imperialism of the past. So does it make sense to call this kind of relationship as peace? Because it seems to me that it's a sort of trying to side back the very core of the framework that is advanced, because if we face it, at least for me, it's not peace at all. Of course, we can call it a kind of victor's peace and so on, but is victor's peace a kind of peace? Or because it seems to me that we are still discussing peace ontologically instead of trying to approach peace as a kind of relational concept. And I don't know if I'm clear about my question, and I'd like to hear some comments on that.
I think it's a good point. I mean, well, we use the language of the enemy because we are, under governmentality, we are willing subjects ourselves, and we are dependent in so many ways for this language, dependent on this language. It provides us with many opportunities to do things and to have these debates in the first place. Peace as a kind of a name is always going to be problematic, isn't it? It's a fixed moment in time, and immediately denudes it of the historical resonances, in other words, where it came from, how it's constructed, which could mean it's a victor's peace or not. The processes, the networks, the different dynamics that swirl around peace as a process. But even as a process, it's problematic because it's still this kind of teleology, isn't it, where it has to be progressive, it has to move from A to B to X, Y, and Z, and so forth. At the kind of ontological level, I think if we move away from the idea that there is some utopia or dystopia out there, that we are circulating between all of these things in various different processes, all intertwined and interlocked, then I think we have to then start to think about the politics of peace. This is one of the interesting debates that came up with the hybrid peace arguments. A lot of people say, well, hybrid peace, what really happens is the old tribal leaders or the old warlords, they get back into power and they call it a hybrid peace, and that immediately legitimates their position, because what they're doing is saying, look, we're local, we're authentic, we are the indigenous authority, we have legitimate authority in this context because of a whole range of historic contexts. But that's the politics of peace that are working themselves out, rather than this end state peace which we have in our own Western secular problem-solving imaginary of what peace should look like. And again, I think the evidence tends to show that that is a pipe dream. In fact, what we're really looking at are a whole series of political, interlocking, networked relationships and processes which involve power, which involve authority, legitimacy, structural, governmental, subaltern forms of power, all kind of swirling around each other. What it means for peace, well, I'm not sure. I don't think as scholars or as policymakers and so on, we should give up on peace. It's useful. As a conceptual label, it directs us somewhere where we know that there will be let's say, more equity, less killing, more plausible, stable, long-term order, etc., environmental aspects, and so on. So we need to be wary of giving it up, just like we need to be wary of giving up the international architecture of peace building that we currently have, because we can easily say it's a product of the colonial world, and it reifies the hierarchy of that world, just calls it peace. But on the other hand, if we were to get rid of it, then we'd be in trouble too. So I think there has to be some kind of midway where we recognise the deficiencies of any ontological statements like that, the epistemological fixity or rigidity that comes with it, and also see, in contrast, the widening community that's entering the debate today. And the widening of that community, I mean, there are more subjects involved in the debate about peace, the nature of the state, today, in the world, than there ever have been, by far. And the last 20 years has been quite productive in terms of that increase. And some of that was because of state building and liberal peace building. So we have to see these things as incredibly complicated. I mean, critiquing peace building and state building is not on the one hand to say get rid of them completely. It's not on the other hand to say, well, Paris might say, let's rescue them. It's to see them as part of a very complex political framework, as I try to explain here. And somewhere in there, around it, we might see fleetingly moments where various conditions of peace that we would subjectively recognise, in my case it might be a social democracy with a kind of welfare framework, with a whole kind of range of pluralistic respects and protections and so on, occurs, but fleetingly it might be gone. This is the thing, I think, which we find hard in the West. We're very used to thinking that we establish the architecture, the state, the law, the institutions, and that's it. And then we kind of get lazy and it collapses. Because we forget about the consent and legitimacy and the way in which authority is constructed, and the historical questions and the hierarchy and so on, and the fact that progressive means that there's always something better that can be done, and there will always be someone challenging and resisting. There will always be a debate, and that debate will have political content. Political content means agency, however small, itself has an impact.
Thanks so much for the presentation, Oliver. I'm not sure about your distinction between peace building and state building, or at least the way you expressed it during the presentation. If it's just a matter of ambition, you yourself said that the ambition of the peace building endeavour in the 90s very quickly became much narrower than it was. And I do think that the way we do state building now in places like Iraq and Afghanistan are still within the liberal framework. So it doesn't distinguish it that much from peace building. You might say that we're not engaged in doing the military dimension of peace building, but we're doing security sector reform, which is kind of a new generation of it. It doesn't really, it's not different from a liberal perspective. And also, even if you do have a more externalized way of putting Hamid Karzai in power, there was still a semblance of doing it according to power sharing that had some kind of local agreement or something. So I don't really see that much of a difference between peace building and state building. And the fact that they're exactly the same type of donors, as you said, a handful, it's hard to me to imagine that they're actually undertaking something completely different in two different places at the exact same time, because you still have the follow-ups from peace building operations in the 90s. So yeah, so I wanted to push you on that.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
Oh, sorry. Shall I continue?
Yeah.
And then I have another question regarding our goal. So our goal in terms of reinforcing structures of peace that are still locally legitimate. And so our role in terms of us that are doing research on these topics, is it to give more visibility to everyday peace, which I think it's important, but I'm actually quite... I like the fact that you mentioned Gramsci's argument about making it visible means that they're capturable by the exercise of power. And so we do know that there are several places where endeavours like peace building didn't really reach most of the local communities. They're still doing, it didn't really affect their daily lives that much, and they're still doing their practices of peace formation without really being affected by whatever was being done by the international. So giving them more visibility might actually be a problem. But still, we might think that from a research perspective, it makes sense to do some kind of lessons learned exercise. And so if we give more visibility to everyday peace, we might take examples from one place to the other and maybe do something. And then what is our role then? Is it the empowerment of those structures of peace, local structures of peace? And then it gets tricky again, because the word empowerment is not exactly new. So it seems to me that we're trying to do that already, even if unsuccessful. So I'm still not sure about what's the goal of the international in your framework.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, and I have a provocative question. May I?
Oh yeah, let's have that.
So, assuming you don't say, I'm going to do field work, what do you say when you go to East Timor for months?
Okay, that's good. That's a good question. In terms of this idea of, well, the peace formation, enablement, empowerment, intervention, all of these terms are being kind of bracketed in a common project, which is the projection of a certain set of standards. And I think that the difference between peace building and state building is that the standards are different. Now, there's no word peace in state building. I mean, state building really is just establishing the very limited institutions of state necessary to provide security, mainly because the way in which domestic security spills over into regional security structures is very problematic. And so it's obviously good to pacify domestically to produce hard external boundaries of the state and to hope that that will maintain a kind of quasi-Westphalian peace wherever it might be applied. And all the social and most of the political stuff, I think, is very watered down under state building. Yes, it's still democratic, but we'll do deals with whomever we need to as well. Yes, we'd like to do some human rights stuff, but we don't have much money for civil society, so we don't really bother that much. And yes, we do developments, and that's, I suppose, one of the big anomalies, for example, in Afghanistan with the CDCs and so on. And we hand over developmental authority to local villagers and tribes, but that kind of delegates also responsibility in the politics and the cultural codes and all the rest of it. So it's a step back from defining how one would act politically or socially under the peace-building framework, I think. So it's kind of liberal peace-building light from one perspective. But if you see the neoliberal state, which I call failed state building, as an ideological project, in a way it's liberal peace-building not light. This is the harshest version of liberal peace-building that you could imagine. I mean, denuded of the substance of the human rights and democratic ethos of liberal peace-building, which at least gave it some respectability, even if it was mainly a project which existed in the minds of a few senior UN policymakers and their buddies in the North American scholarly world. So I think state building has a difference. I mean, yeah, of course they're still within the same liberal universe, but the nature of states that liberal peace building, I think, envisioned, let's say for Cambodia, was a bit different to the one that emerged, which I think is much more, which is much more acceptable under a state building set of premises. So the state is much more something which we would recognise coming out of, I suppose, the kind of Asian financial crisis, in which there are authoritarian structures, in which the word democracy is a label which is bandied around, and which the economy is roaring, so nobody cares, nobody's fighting, the troubles are washed away. Let's try in Northern Ireland, I think, as well, to some degree too. And the normative premise of liberal peace building is much more rigorous, I think. It's much more that there will be a demos, and there will be a set of institutional frameworks which will be followed, and the legal code will be much more in favour of that aspect of citizenship than it will be in favour of a kind of securitized, marketised citizenship. So maybe it's subtle, but I think there's still a difference.
It's more imposing.
State building.
No, liberal peace building.
Well, liberal peace building is more governmental, I would say. Yeah, it's more a product of governmentality, but people like that too. People want democracy, they want to have human rights, and they want to have a rule of law, and they want to be part of the international community. So, state building is more difficult to sell, I think, because it doesn't really offer that kind of progressive, which people can then renegotiate. they can say, yes, you're trying to be progressive, all this human rights and democracy stuff, but where is it? We want it. Where's this development stuff? We want it. Whereas under state building, there's not much to say. Well, thanks for your security. I'm still starving. You know. So that's why peaceful nations suggests enablement, I think, and empowerment. So yeah, it's not new. This, of course, has been used. It keeps coming up. We keep having to repeat it. It's really boring. I'm really tired of it. I wish we could actually get into the minds of people who actually exercise power democratically, that there are political actors, agents, and subjects. We need to respect them, regardless of what we think of them. So, anyway, I mean, being serious, it kind of does say we have to jettison the language of intervention. Now, in one historical phase, let's say in the 20th century, the Enlightenment view, who in those days were kind of liberal realists, you know, things have moved on, did say we need to jettison the language and practice of invasion. Invasion became illegal, and now we have the legitimated invasion, which is intervention. Now, intervention has been extended into structural adjustments, into civil society, the economy, politics, and institutions, all the rest of it. And now it's time to jettison intervention, because we are, step by step, moving towards a realisation of both historical justice and the weight of historical power structures, which seem to naturalise a particular order, its hierarchy, and set practices, intervention being one of them. Well, I think that's really quite problematic, given that if we take the basic anthropological premise to be true, which I think probably is, I don't like truth, that every society evolves its own peace structures, in juxtaposition to the conflict structures, the power, the hierarchy, the historic system that it's subject to. Why wouldn't it? How couldn't it? I mean, it just doesn't seem to make any sense to me to assume, a la state formation, that societies only want to kill each other. Anyway, so I mean, it does suggest that we need to refine the language, you know, and that's the brings me to because language is practice, as we know, language is power, and using words like intervention, governance, capacity building, the field, it's insulting, really. If I was on the receiving end of that, I'd probably punch somebody. And it's not just, I'm being flippant, it's not just insulting, it's redolent of power, historical structures of power, and the need to preserve them, which I think is increasingly completely unfeasible. This is why I don't have much trouble with IR theory, because even at the critical end of IR theory, it still recognises that there are embedded natural structures of authority and legitimacy, which are very narrowly constrained in the Eurocentric view of the world. There are there are interesting work swirling around the perimeter of IR, which has done a lot about that. And one very good book which I read recently, which is kind of really an undergraduate text, but I think it's really good to bring this message out, is called Decentering IR by the crowd from the University of York in the US. And it's very interesting in the way in which unpicks these conceptual terms that we throw about, security, order, and so on, and shows how they are constructed to naturalise insecurity and discipline and hierarchy and so on. It's very good. Which brings me to fieldwork. Now, all of us speak in different languages. I mean, I'm a monoglottal Brit, I apologise, I'm sorry, but you speak in different languages. But even when we only speak one language, we do speak in different languages. So when I talk to donors, policymakers, people who fund my research and my travel and so on, of course I use this word fieldwork. It's the only word they understand. Otherwise, if I said I'm going to Timor, they'd think I was going for a holiday. But of course, think about it. Would you ever go to Timor or any field site of yours and talk to people that you're working with or working on, or who are your informants, etc., etc., all this awful language that we use? Would you ever say that to them? Oh yeah, I'm here, I'm doing some field work on you. You're not going to get any response. So we already know this. We already know, subconsciously or perhaps openly, that a lot of the terminology that we use, a lot of the language that we use, naturalises a historical order. And in that historical order are perhaps some good things, but also a lot of injustice, which we have been very reluctant to unpick in the last 20 years in the West, in the global North. Or we've unpicked it in very marginal ways. The MDGs. Okay, so it shows us that 1 in 3 of the world's population live under a certain $1.2, $2.5 a day, but what about the other 3? Okay, so it's only 1 in 5 who actually live in the top quadrant, and the rest of them are below 2.5. Is that any better? So there's these kinds of sleights of hand going on, in the kind of development community, in the peace building community, and so on, which says there are poor people, there are conflict subjects, there are refugees, and it defines them in certain ways according to arbitrary limits, and it forgets very large but very closely related groups of the world's population who are also similarly disadvantaged. And in some places it's very explicit, for example in Palestine, and in other places it's rather subtle, and that's also another story. So we use this language duplicitously, and I think that's a sign of its collapse. These terms are collapsing, and if anyone wants to write an article which will perhaps create a big splash, then reinvent some language for the new era. We are in a new world, we're in a new situation. The whole donor system is changing, the whole peace building framework is changing, state building, well discredited, peace building, very dodgy ground. Development, long been in problems. We've had the Busan framework, we've got the G7+, things are really changing in a way. People have even been talking about the G77 and the new international economic order and these sorts of things again. Interesting things going on. So now is the time where there's just a little bit of space to raise these issues and to bring them up. And I think it's not just happening amongst a critical crowd of policymakers who speak in private only and scholars who sometimes dare speak in public. It's also happening amongst the mainstream as well. I mean, if you look at Fukuyama's book on political order, look at the introduction. He talks about state building. He starts to talk about hybridity and local agency and subjectivity. Just towards the end, you can see there is a dawning awareness that here is this hybrid American scholar who is suddenly experiencing the world and practicing intervention in new ways. It's very interesting to see that. And it's not just from his perspective as well. Look at the latest World Bank reports, starting to talk about people's security. It's a reinvention of human security, but they can't use human security because it was problematic before. And starting to talk about people's contract. It's a social contract, they can't use that, but anyway. These terms keep coming back because they are essential. They're essential to politics. And it's not just happening in the major institutions, it's happening in the donors too. The donors are starting to realise that for the last 5 years they've stopped funding civil society because they realised that civil society was forming parallel and politicised and very tense relationships with their own elites, which will often lead to court cases, tension, maybe conflict, and therefore they thought it was counterproductive. And now they've realised that that's the point of civil society, so we better bring it back. And they're starting to think now about funding it again. So these things are coming back, there's a bit of space, maybe we can do something. So, field work. It has its place, but it's time to get rid of it, I would say. But still do it, obviously. But it has to be done in a completely different way. It has to be done in the knowledge that there are power relations, that it has to be reciprocal, that we're both subjects, in any kind of field arrangement. It has to be a system of partnership. And actually the donors are way ahead of us. The donors start talking about their local collaborators, to use an earlier term, as partners. And it's perhaps time we start to think about this too. The co-production of knowledge.
In fact, I'm afraid I might repeat some of the questions that were already posed. First of all, by rejecting the word intervention, how could one act under the peace formation framework that you presented? Secondly, how can we know? How can we gather information in the field? How can we bring those epistemologies that were killed by the West? And when you talked about emancipation, and I think that you have made an evolution from local forms to different levels, aren't you following the same modernization and evolutionist pattern from the state building classic theory?
Yep. It's a bit black and white to say, how can we act if you reject intervention? The point is to think about how acting takes place in its context, in the structural frameworks, with the subjectivities and the agencies around it, and for what reasons. And I think that people were doing this with state building, peace building. Obviously, many people thought these were important and good, and in some ways they were. But there are so many subjects, agencies, and structures involved in that type of intervention, which seep into and, if you like, perhaps distort the original intentions and produce something else. Now, we're supposed to be scientists. I think we can work on that basis, that nothing is as it seems, and every action has some kind of unintended consequence. And if there is to be a basic parameter which guides, I suppose, scholarly work and policy work in conflict, developmental or post-conflict settings, we shouldn't be making it worse than it already is. And we certainly shouldn't be experimenting on human subjects. As we know, when we go and do fieldwork, we also have these forms saying there will be no experimentation on human subjects, which is fortunately quite constraining, because I've got all kinds of things in mind when I go on fieldwork. But anyway, rejecting intervention, I think, is not quite the point. It's seeing how intervention is politically loaded, and it's also loaded with power. It's a discursive framework. It does all kinds of things that we expect it shouldn't, and some people expect it should. And so, when we think about revising this relationship of power in the historical context that we see it, which is a hierarchical progressive system, which has fortunately placed the West at the top, able to intervene, to bring along, to drag up the rest. As we start to revise that and think about the ways in which the international is responsible for local conflicts, the ways in which many conflicts are products themselves of historical injustices that the international was complicit with in the past. And so these sorts of things start to change the way in which we perhaps would think normatively and strategically about intervention. And that's why, I guess, talking about changing the language, I mean, I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be an intervention in Syria, that the war doesn't need to be stopped or the regime doesn't need to be toppled. But when we think about what that means and the opportunities it provides for a whole series of structural adjustment type practices, which would then follow, that's when things start to get really, I think, problematic. So we need to have a much more sophisticated understanding of different types of intervention, if we must use that word, at different stages and consequences. And who has the right to determine those interventions? If there is a moment when interventions have to take place without consent, when does the consent kick in? When do the subjects of intervention say, this is how things shall be? In their own understanding of both international and domestic order. Now, this is a question which I think, a debate which we could perhaps usefully have in these conflict studies. We've not had it. Anyway, how do we gather information on the ground? Why do we gather information on the ground? And what do we gather it for? I think the points of some of the kind of post-colonial scholarship on methodology that we've seen emerging in the last 20 years has been to underline how much of what we do as scholars, whether for critical or mainstream reasons, is immediately co-opted and instrumentalised in the policy setting. And as governmentality, if you like, increases its reach, we become much more complicit and much more exposed in gathering information. And this, what happens to that information? If knowledge is power, then we have to be very careful with what we do with that kind of information. And I think we have a long way to go before we can, all of us, feel safe in international relations, in knowing that the knowledge we gather and the way we present it will not be cycled through structural or governmental power. And it's notable that we as researchers are subject to a range of guidelines and constraints methodologically, but our policy fraternity, who wants impact and wants policy advice, are not. So, while the ways in which we act and research in the field are heavily constrained to operate within a certain set of parameters which have been historically established already, so which are also rather narrow, what happens to our research is pretty much anyone's guess. And that's the problem. Why do we gather this information? Using a range of methodologies, whether quantitative or qualitative, whether site-based, network-based, action-based, or whatever it might be. Why do we do this when we know that information is dangerous, it's exploitable, it's exposable? For example, with this so-called local term in peace and conflict studies, where all of a sudden we've realised that there are political actors out there who have the right to define for themselves how peace, institutions, state, rights and law would be constructed. How do we know this isn't just another British colonial epistemology, a methodology in which we establish or re-establish the right to intervene of the superior citizen over the native? Well, we can only be aware of it, I think, but we can't know. And in fact, many, there have already been accusations that this is what's going on. And in fact, some quite conservative scholars have been saying that international relations is international because we don't want to let loose this kind of information into the corridors of power. So the state has to remain the black box. And again, we're back into the same cycle again. Well, if the state remains the black box, how do we have justice? How do we have security? How do we have, consensual arrangements between domestic and international, and so on? So it's kind of halfway. We're in a halfway position. The same with emancipation. And of course, emancipation has this kind of progressive. I suppose it has this also Marxist genesis. It also has a religious genesis too. It sees social conditions, the world constructed in a certain way, progressivism, social rights and justice, structural power mitigated by the masses and centralized authority and so on, perhaps. There are different ways in which you can take emancipation. And I'm not thinking of it in those terms. I'm trying to think of it in terms of a kind of post-colonial sensibility, or rather a subaltern post-colonial sensitivity. In other words, what are the issues, the pressing everyday issues that somebody who's thinking about everyday life, peace, order and justice would want to resolve? And then what could be done about that? Would it be an intervention? Would it be an empowerment? Would it be an enablement? And so on. We're all products of our upbringing. I mean, we're all, or many of us are, subjects of European history. We can't jettison these terms immediately, but we can redefine and redevelop them. I think that's what's happening.
One final question, Nelson?
Thank you. I was wondering about the liberal order that you talked about, the world liberal order, and my main doubt would be how to create this peace formation model, or how to export something that we don't use at home. So if we consider that we are in a liberal model and we have some kind of social conflicts within that may be disguised under some kind of prosperity and social measures, how can we go to the field, the post-conflict field, as I would say, and try something different that we never experimented at home, and something that perhaps wouldn't make sense for those who finance most of the efforts? Do you think this would be some? Is this logical for you?
Yes. Simple answer. I mean, I think peace formation can't be created externally. Peace formation is an encounter between local customs, traditions, institutions, politics, political order, hierarchy, resource distribution, environmental use, and the international standardized version of this, which, by the way, is also a bit of fantasy. But it's an encounter between those, and in different places it comes out in different ways. So that's why we see such a variety of forms of polity. When you look at the world from below, and you look out, you see every state is quite different. It's only when you look from above, and you look down, that you can see this homogeneous set of polities interlocking, and so on. So from that sense, it's not something which is exported. I mean, this whole language of intervention, exporting, it's a kind of structural adjustment language. This is the modernizer at his apogee in the 1950s and 1960s, surveying the world and saying, a la Prospero, this is what we can make with magic, effectively. And I think this is not the reality. This is not what science tells us. This is not what the facts say. This is not what the nature of the institutions that we have to deal with from very different polities all around the world. This is not what we know. This is a dream. Forget it. It's just not out there. So this encounter is politics between the international and local, if you want to say. It's crude binary, but it's the ways in which politics is formed through these circulating forms of power, policies, agencies, actors, some hidden, some supporting, some more significant, some formal, some state, and so on. All seeking to negotiate, on the one hand, perhaps domination, and on the other hand, some kind of emancipatory form of politics. I can't help but use this language. We don't have any other language, but let's find it. It'd be great if we could. But I don't think that any kind of externalized notion of peace building or state building, purely externalized, in which you create a model and you export it as a blueprint around the world, hasn't got hope in hell's chance. Because the lesson in the last 20 years has been it will be resisted at every quarter. And the only people who will comply with it are the ones who make the most money from it. And so the states that will emerge will tend to be predatory and authoritarian. And that is what Tilly said when he talked about state formation. He said that that's what the locals produce, but it isn't. That's an encounter between a certain local and a certain international. And that's what's been produced mostly until recently. And I think there are some hopeful signs that now it maybe has provided some space in which the more kind of local agencies can renegotiate their encounter, can think about the things that the Western liberals hold dear, democracy, human rights, and rule of law, and so on. Think about what it means in their own context, where they have traditions of democracy, human rights, and so on, development and resource distribution, and begin these acts of translation that are taking place. It's very interesting. If you start to look at, I've heard, because of course I don't read this literature myself, but if you start to look at the academies that are forming in these more stabilized post-conflict states now, where local scholars, networks, internationally local scholars, are starting now to write about conflict resolution, transformation, peace building, civil society. They're kind of replicating the debates that we've had. They are starting to imagine how it would look from their own perspective, in their own context. So looking from the inside, out at the polity, out at the world, and writing about international relations and politics from that perspective. Some of these people now work in Western universities and are bringing a whole range of enlightenments to Western scholars, even in North America, you'd be pleased to hear. And this is an encounter which is also happening at the scholarly level. And again, the policymakers got there first, because the UN was one of the first venues or fora where that could actually happen, where a range of representatives around the world could come together and start to negotiate and renegotiate their understanding of institutions and practices and law and so on in international relations.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and hear this very interesting presentation, lots of food for thought.
Thank you.
Although I must say that some of us at least, are probably puzzling a little bit, because last week we had Professor Ken Booth telling us that IR...
You should have told me that last night.
Yeah, IR still matters and there's so much you can do, and then you started your presentation and said that IR theory is dead. So we will have to come out of this dilemma and hopefully do something with it. So thank you very much, Oliver, for coming and for giving us this very interesting presentation. Thank you.